Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
This is KRWG Public Media, TV, radio, online, news that matters. Now, across the Mesilla Valley and the borderland, the stories that shape our community. From the KRWG Broadcast Center at New Mexico State University, this is Newsmakers.
Welcome to Newsmakers. I'm Anthony Moreno. We kick things off with news in mental health. The Crisis Triage Center in Doña Ana County reopened this month with a new operator. KRWG's Jonny Coker has more in this report.
Nearly a year after closing its doors to patients, the Doña Ana County Crisis Triage Center is back in operation. Micah Pearson is a community advocate and a former patient of the CTC, and said having the center reopened is crucial to address gaps in behavioral health care.
Within 10 minutes of walking in here, I was talking to a peer support worker, and they provided a nice, calm, quiet environment for me to get out of my head, as opposed to a loud, chaotic emergency department where you wait for 4 hours to even just talk to anybody in a triage environment, or 12 hours to get back up into a psychiatric unit if you're lucky if they have one. Again, when I was in jail, I was lucky that jail had a psychiatric unit that took me a week to get into. But here I was in a calm, quiet environment that they were able to talk to me and I was able to chill out.
Last January, RI International, the facility's previous behavioral health provider, ceased operations after the company was denied grant money by the Board of Doña Ana County Commissioners, narrowing the options for individuals seeking treatment amid mental health crises. According to the latest data from the New Mexico Department of Health, mental health emergencies accounted for 7.4% of emergency department visits in the state between July and September of last year. Pearson said that having the CTC operational will be instrumental in helping individuals in crisis avoid potentially traumatic experiences within emergency clinics and the criminal justice system.
To have a center that provides the services that we do for our general community is unbelievably vital. And the fact that we're able to, with the reopening, we're able to come back and actually take another look at it, have a 2.0 release, as it were, and learn from what we did the previous time and have just another shot at it where the community comes together and really works together this time to provide wraparound services, better connections than we did the first time, makes it even a better web with a greater interconnectedness.
County Commissioner Shannon Reynolds was one of the officials who voted against the grant that led to the previous provider leaving, but said he's happy to collaborate with Summit Behavioral Health due to the company already having a successful operating behavioral health clinic in the southern part of the county.
Summit is planning to have full-time staff here 24/7. They're going to be following the right policies for intake. They're going to be open and available. They're going to be basically doing it right. And Recovery International was trying to actually, in my opinion, capitalize on a revenue without actually providing the needed service. And I know the service was good, but it wasn't what we really needed. It wasn't comprehensive enough to meet the needs of the entire community.
While the CTC has only been open for a few weeks, Sandy Emanuel, Market CEO for Summit Behavioral Healthcare, said that there's been a considerable amount of collaboration within the community to get the center open and called the relationship with law enforcement critically important.
Law enforcement comes across individuals in the community all the time who are having a psychiatric or a substance abuse crisis, and we're a resource for them that they can easily hand off and let psychiatric professionals take care of the individual as opposed to law enforcement trying to figure out what to do with them, spending a long time with them, navigating other systems to try to figure out how to hand off somebody in a safe manner.
Since the triage center closed last year, Jamie Michael, director of the Department of Health and Human Services of Doña Ana County, immediately began searching for a provider to fill the void. And while there's still considerable work to be done, Michael said having Summit Behavioral Health at the helm has her optimistic about the future of mental health care in the community.
It's such a relief to make it to this point for me, for the entire team at the county, to see all of our work result in something so successful, and to see the open arms for everyone in the community to really welcome the facility back open. It feels good. And now I can kind of redirect some of my time and energy to other critical things that we need to focus on. But it's definitely a time to celebrate.
As the CTC begins under a new provider, community members and leaders alike are hopeful that reopening will not only address current needs, but set a new example for mental health care in Doña Ana County and beyond. For KRWG Public Media, I'm Jonny Coker.
New Mexico lawmakers have kicked off a 60-day legislative session in the state to focus on many issues. Some of those issues may focus on how the state is addressing energy policy and taking on climate challenges. Joining us now to share more about these issues is Lucas Herndon, Energy Policy Director with ProgressNow New Mexico. Lucas, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. Always happy to be here.
Now, New Mexico Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham recently gave her State of the State address. She did carve out a little moment to talk about climate goals that she would like to see the state achieve. There's certainly some lawmakers that have some proposals as well. What is your organization targeting in this 60-day legislative session?
Yeah, well, we were all very excited to hear her really tout zero emissions by 2050. It's been a long-term goal of ProgressNow and other advocacy groups in the state for a long time. The piece of legislation that she was addressing is called the Clear Horizons Act. And it is a piece of legislation that will address greenhouse gas emissions and set a series of benchmarks to reach by 2030, 2040, and then 2050 net zero emissions. So that affects all climate greenhouse gas emissions that cause climate change. And this is in line with her 2019 executive order that addressed specifically methane. But because that was an executive order, we haven't really codified it into law. And so this is an opportunity for the legislature to, as she kind of stated a few times, she's in her last 2 years. So before she leaves office, she would really love to see this as something that is a lasting legacy for her administration to codify real work on addressing climate change at the emissions level.
Now, speaking of methane, that's obviously been an issue in the southeastern part of the state where the oil and gas industry is booming in recent years. There's been a lot of reporting on how the state is addressing that. There's been some concerns on just really the enforcement of that issue dealing with methane. We've heard from the state environment department and some reporting out there that there's just challenges trying to get this done. What do you see being the major problem with trying to regulate methane in the state?
Yeah, well, for listeners and viewers who may not know, New Mexico is a little different than most states. In most states, the number one source of emissions is transportation, automobiles. But in New Mexico, it's direct source emissions, meaning it's the oil and gas companies and their drilling directly. That's the number one source of emissions. And so dealing with that is a little bit more difficult. There's already a ton of regulations, both nationally at the state level when it comes to vehicles. But when you're talking about, multi-trillion-dollar companies that control oil and gas, it's a little bit more difficult to regulate those companies. So one of the parts of that has to do with the funding that the legislature sets aside for the agencies who are charged with that regulation. In addition to the Clear Horizons Act, that bill's sponsor, Senator Mimi Stewart, has proposed legislation that would provide funding to those agencies to more directly combat climate change and increase funding for their regulatory roles. Additionally, after the legislation, something that we're looking at ProgressNow from the administrative side is last year the EPA issued federal methane rules. And in New Mexico, because we have both state lands and federal lands, despite the fact that New Mexico has had methane laws or methane rules on the books for a few years, those oil and gas wells that are on federal land aren't overseen by our state regulators. So it is imperative that New Mexico sign on to those federal rules. And so as soon as we're done with the legislature, we'll be pivoting hard towards making sure that the administration gets on top of that. We have another full year, so spring of 2026 is the deadline for the states to sign on to those federal rules. And we're hoping that New Mexico can lead by example and be one of the early adopters.
When your conversation with state lawmakers and state lawmakers on both sides of the aisle, what are they saying to you in regards to addressing this issue?
Well, they're looking at both polling data and election results. And that is, New Mexicans want action on climate change. The most recent polls show that 60% of respondents, without being asked, say that climate is their number one concern. And there are other concerns, of course, and especially with the sort of new change in the federal administration, there's a lot of unknowns in New Mexico. People do have a lot of concerns when it comes to the economy, education, the business environment, all those things. But still, we see New Mexicans are really looking for and calling for climate action. And so when we're having conversations with lawmakers, and when we see the lawmakers who are coming in, we have a huge freshman class of lawmakers in both the House and the Senate this year. There are a lot of climate champions in those new classes and still coming back. So the climate is on their minds, and they're diving in, and it's not just the Clear Horizons Act. There's a slate of climate bills this year addressing everything from electric vehicles, geothermal technology, obviously the emissions, grid modernization. I mean, you name it. There's already legislation about it.
Well, we have plenty of time, so let's dive into that a little bit. What are some other bills that you're focused on right now to address the climate challenges?
Yeah, so grid modernization is a big one. New Mexico has seen an enormous growth in our renewable energy portfolio, the amount of energy that we produce and use that's coming from renewables. One of the issues that we see, and it's not just in New Mexico, but across the West specifically, is the ability for those produced kilowatts from wherever they're being produced to get to the grid. And so updating the grid physically, having the legislation and the policy around that is important. So we see that bill come up this year. There's also a oil and gas royalties rate bill. So the amount that the oil and gas companies pay the state to lease the land to produce oil, that hasn't been increased since the 1970s. And so we really think that should be increased.
Let's dive into that a little bit. Compared to other states, how is New Mexico doing with that?
Well, we're less than the federal amount, and we are less than our neighbor Texas. So the rates are not specific. They fluctuate anywhere on a percentage scale, but the max percentage in New Mexico is 20%, whereas in Texas and on the federal land it's 25%. And so that missed 5% of potential income off of premium allotments is in the multiple hundreds of millions of dollars that New Mexicans are not receiving back, and that the oil and gas companies are pocketing.
I see. The oil and gas industry, obviously a very powerful industry in New Mexico. They're responsible, I think the Albuquerque Journal reported recently, to around 35% of the state's budget for this year with lawmakers, with what they're looking at, putting together the budget. So how do you really address these changes with an industry that is responsible for so much of the state's finances? Yeah,
there's a common misconception that we want to see the end of oil and gas, and it's just not true. First of all, New Mexico is a leader in oil and gas. It's not nothing to be the second largest oil and gas producing state in the entire country. And the families that rely on oil and gas are a huge part of our community, and there are, whole, cities that rely on oil and gas, not just for the direct revenue, but for all of the service positions and the homes and the infrastructure that it provides. what we're looking for are just better neighbors, better partners. And so being able to play by the rules, making sure that the pollution that is sort of a necessary part of their industry is regulated, and that if they violate them, that they're paying the appropriate fees and cleaning up after themselves, and that they're paying their fair share back into the state when they do use our lands for those resources.
What sort of economic opportunities do you see with regulating the industry, or perhaps the industry moving towards more cleaner methods when it comes to perhaps reusing water, recycled water, or other areas capturing methane? Is there economic opportunities here that may be possible?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. The governor has, the last couple years, floated this idea that she calls the strategic water supply. And very simply put, it would be a plan wherein the brackish water and the waste that comes up from fracking, other than the petroleum itself, could be treated, and then that water could be reused somewhere else along the production line within industry. To be very clear, there are a lot of concerns from a number of different folks about what that looks like. We don't know what's in that fracking fluid. It makes it a little difficult to regulate when it comes to how do you set limits for what particulate matter is in it, for instance, if you don't know what those particulates are. And frankly, it is concerning where that water could go. On the and on the economic side, while the governor has touted that it potentially creates a new market for the state, her plan actually sort of creates a market that doesn't exist at the expense of taxpayers, because the money would come from the taxes that oil and gas is currently paying into the state budget. That would be where we get the funds to start this program. And so in a way, they'd be able to take advantage of a program paid for by their own taxes, which is kind of another tax break for them, really. So we have some concerns about that, because it doesn't feel like a net economic gain for the state of New Mexico.
So it sounds like, from what you're saying, there's still a lot of unknowns. For example, how this water is going to be used or treated, or perhaps what industries it's going to be used in as well, and the effects that it could have on our local communities. Obviously, there's concern about protecting our aquifers and other industries that may be impacted by this. I mean, is there anything specific that comes to your mind?
Yeah, I mean, we've already seen, the city of Alamogordo, the city of Carlsbad, in recent years wrestle with water contamination from brackish water. So the water that's under the ground, especially in the southeastern part of the state, tends to be higher salinity, has a lot more salts in it. And that's useful for the oil and gas industry, because they need that kind of water to do fracking. However, that water is not good for city infrastructure. It's hard on pipes. Even if you do treat it, it's extremely expensive and energy non-efficient to treat it and to then use it as usable water. We've already seen the evidence of what highly salinated brackish water can do in communities, which is to say it's very hard on their infrastructure, and then you have to reallocate funds back in to repair those things, bring in desalination, and so water is obviously a huge issue in the state, especially fresh and clean water, and it's a little bit above my own pay grade, but one of the things that is frustrating is that the term freshwater in New Mexico actually has a legal definition, and so it doesn't just mean water in a stream or water you can drink, and so when the governor and her advocates are supporting this idea of turning brackish water into usable water, those are all legal definitions that we're all just still we're unsure of, where we just don't know what exactly that means, where it will be used, where it's coming from, and what's in it.
Well, one thing's for sure is anytime you're talking about water in New Mexico, there's going to be a lot of conversations about how we're using it and what's going on with it. You brought up electric vehicles. New Mexico's taken some steps recently to address electric vehicles in the state and the role they may be playing in the future. But what are your concerns about the change of a new federal administration coming in and how some of those programs may be affected that New Mexico has put in at the state level, the action on the federal level? Do you have any concerns there on how that may impact it?
Yeah, there's some concern, like especially when we think about how some of the funds that would be directed towards building EV infrastructure, like charging stations along the highways, that funding is now maybe in question. And New Mexico is a large state, and while there are plenty of vehicles, electric vehicles on the market that can make it between, say, here in Albuquerque, just like with a gas vehicle, you want to know that if you needed to, you could stop along the way and top up. And while there are plans in place to continue to build out that EV infrastructure along major travel routes like I-25 and I-40, that's one of the major concerns with the change in administration right now is how is that federal funding going to maybe affect some of those things.
Any other issues in the state legislature that your organization is eyeing when it comes to climate and our energy policy?
Well, right now, those are all the big ones, the ones we've talked about. We are looking at a couple of bills that have to do with funding communities directly when it comes to extreme weather events as it relates to climate change. So it's kind of related. Unfortunately, in the last year, we've seen communities across the state affected by both fires and then floods. And while you get some emergency funding by the state, and then in some cases the feds declaring an emergency, there's a couple of bills right now that would actually start to pre-fund communities to build up that kind of infrastructure. Because unfortunately, as we've been seeing all across the country and even across the world, we're not really at a if moment, we're at a when moment, and communities are having to plan for an event like, again, high heat or extreme cold, fires, floods, and so having funds available to build out that infrastructure is increasingly important, and so those are the couple bills that we're also paying attention to.
This is an issue that's impacted just so many parts of the state. The northern part of the state has seen fires and floods. The southern part of the state has seen fires and floods. So how confident are you that lawmakers are going to address this issue when so many communities have been impacted?
Well, I think that on these bills, I know that the term climate change or climate emergency can maybe scare off some folks from a certain side of the aisle, but those folks all come from communities who've experienced something, and we've actually heard and even seen in terms of some of the bill sponsors that there is support from lawmakers, despite their political affiliation, when it comes to directly funding communities for emergency response. It's just sort of a common sense thing in the world we live in, and especially for some of those communities that were really impacted, like in the Southeast, Ruidoso, Roswell. We have lawmakers there that see the value in planning ahead, and so we have high hopes for those bills.
What are some immediate goals your organization has for this year in connecting not only policymakers but communities to the information about dealing with our climate that's changing, getting warmer, as well as other issues that your organization is working on?
Yeah, well, at ProgressNow New Mexico, we are the largest digital communications group in the state, and we work on a number of issues. I work on climate, but I have colleagues that work in a number of fields. One of our sort of big focuses is the spread of disinformation and misinformation, and how that affects every topic that you might be interested in. And so we have spearheaded a couple of different standalone programs, campaigns that they reach New Mexicans where they're at on social media and in community to help educate them about, what to look for when it comes to a news story. Is this news source worthy? Is it something worth sharing? And especially sort of again with the results of the election and where we are at now, there is there's just a lot of not great information out there. Sometimes it's directly targeted at New Mexicans and where you can vote or how you can vote or how the legislature is acting or how a bill is going to impact you. Other times it's just misleading, and so there's sort of a gradient, and becoming educated about that is the first sort of step in defense. So that's one of the things that we're doing. When it comes to other policies that we're looking at this year, and kind of in line with that, we are looking at a digital privacy bill that would help protect children in the state from some of these predatory practices that a lot of social media companies now have and targeting children to use their apps. We're also in support of paid family medical leave, which got very close last year.
It's certainly going to be a big conversation in the legislature this year. We saw how that played out in elections in the past year with that issue. Unfortunately, we're out of time.
Sure.
Lucas Herndon is Energy Policy Director with ProgressNow New Mexico. Lucas, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks again, Anthony.
And we want to thank you for joining us this week. You can always stay updated on news anytime at our website, krwg.org. I'm Anthony Moreno. We'll see you next time on Newsmakers.